On the Beach 1959 is the film that showed exactly how the world could end. Not with one final battle, but with silence. But the version you saw in theaters was already toned down from something far bleaker. Did you know the novel's original ending was so devastating that the director refused to film it? Or that the doomsday weapon that wipes out humanity in this movie is based on a real design? Today, we're uncovering 14 hidden truths about On the Beach 1959, including how the Pentagon and the White House both tried to stop this film from ever reaching the public. Number 1. The ending they refused to film. In the film, the ending begins after the last possible hope has already collapsed. The strange Morse signal from America turns out to be nothing more than a mechanical accident, not a sign of survivors. On the USS Sawfish, Dwight Towers learns that some of his crew are already sick. Instead of waiting to die in Australia, the crew asks to sail back toward the United States because they want to die as close to home as possible. He says goodbye to Moira, then takes the Sawfish back out to sea. The film leaves Moira standing on a cliff, watching the submarine disappear beneath the water. It never shows her taking the pills. It never shows her death. But in Nevil Shute's original 1957 novel, the ending is much colder and bleaker. In the book, the submarine is called USS Scorpion, and Dwight does not take it home to America. He takes it out for one final act of naval duty, to sink the vessel in deep water, rather than leave a US warship full of classified equipment abandoned in a foreign port. Even at the end of the world, Dwight is still thinking like a naval officer. Moira asks if she can come with him, but he refuses. So in this version, Moira drives alone to a cliff top near the sea, and while watching the submarine disappear into the sea, she takes that suicide pills with brandy, imagining that she is following Dwight into death. The novel ends with Moira and all the submarine crew dead. Stanley Kramer, the film's director, seems to have avoided that ending because it was too cold and devastating. He also felt that the ending was too procedural. Since Dwight's final act is military discipline, he does not want classified documents to be exposed, so he takes the submarine out to be sunk. Kramer needed something more immediately human. By having the crew sail back toward America, Kramer turns the ending into a simple emotional idea anyone can understand. When there is no hope left, these men still want to die close to home. Number 2. The scene they couldn't show you. Peter Holmes is a young Australian naval officer, a husband, and a new father. In the story, he represents an ordinary family man forced to prepare his own home for the end of the world. In the film, Peter keeps the suicide pills and explains to Mary how to use them when radiation sickness reaches their family. He even explains what must be done for their baby. But the film stops at the explanation. It does not show Peter actually doing it. The novel is much more explicit. In the book, Peter does not just explain the idea. Because his daughter Jennifer is still an infant, she cannot take the tablets like an adult. So Peter has to use an injection. Near the end of the novel, Peter actually gives Jennifer the lethal injection himself. After that, he and Mary take the suicide pills together. That is the major difference. The film talks about the family's death. The novel makes Peter carry it out. And that makes Shute's version far more devastating. The end of the world is not treated like a heroic disaster scene. It becomes intimate, practical, and almost unbearable. Number 3. The doomsday weapon is real. The cobalt bombs that wipe out humanity in On the Beach are not science fiction. The concept was first described publicly on February 26, 1950, when Hungarian-born physicist Leo Szilard went on American radio and outlined a terrifying idea: take a hydrogen bomb and surround it with a shell of cobalt-59. When the bomb detonates, the neutrons convert the cobalt into cobalt-60, an intensely radioactive isotope, and that radiation does not simply disappear. Even after 10 years, some of it would still be radioactive. It blankets the atmosphere with lethal gamma radiation that drifts around the planet, killing everything in its path. Szilard was not proposing that anyone build this weapon. He was warning the world that nuclear technology was approaching the ability to end all human life. That warning went straight into Shute's novel 7 years later, and became the invisible enemy that no one in the film can outrun. Number 4. The real war plan was worse. Within about a year of the film's release in theaters, the real-world plan for nuclear war was already in place. Declassified documents reveal that the U.S. military's Joint Chiefs of Staff had completed a top-secret war plan known as Psy-Op 62. It called for the launch of more than 3,000 nuclear weapons, including hundreds of hydrogen bombs, against approximately 1,000 targets in the Soviet Union, China, and their allied countries in Asia and Europe. The initial attack was meant to be tightly coordinated, with strikes falling in the opening hours of nuclear war. The scale of the plan was almost beyond comprehension. President Eisenhower himself had seen the casualty estimates. They showed the United States would suffer up to 65% population losses regardless of preparedness. Privately, Eisenhower wrote in his diary that the aftermath would literally be a business of digging ourselves out of the ashes, starting again. In other words, the President of the United States, the man with his finger closest to the button, had reached the same conclusion as a Hollywood film playing down the street. The only difference was that he said it in a classified diary, and Kramer said it on every movie screen in the world. Number 5. The night the film almost came true. On September 26, 1983, Soviet Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was on duty inside Serpukhov 15, a secret Soviet command bunker outside Moscow that monitored OKO, the country's satellite early warning system for nuclear missile launches. Shortly after midnight, the system reported the nightmare scenario. 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles appeared to be heading toward the Soviet Union. Petrov was supposed to pass that warning up the chain of command, a move that could have pushed Soviet leaders toward a retaliatory nuclear strike. But Petrov hesitated. Something did not feel right. A real American first strike, he reasoned, would likely involve hundreds of missiles, not 5. So he judged it a false alarm instead. He was right. The system had been fooled by sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds. Petrov is now widely credited with helping prevent a possible nuclear war. Now consider what Astaire's character says in On the Beach, released 24 years earlier. He describes a scenario where some bloke thought he saw something on a radar screen and launched, setting off a chain reaction that ended civilization. On the Beach imagined a world where that bloke pushed the button. In 1983, the world got lucky because one man chose not to. Number 6. The Pentagon refused to help. The U.S. Department of Defense refused to give Stanley Kramer the kind of cooperation he wanted for On the Beach. Kramer wanted access to an American nuclear-powered submarine so he could portray the fictional USS Sawfish more accurately. But the Pentagon had a serious problem with the film's message. This was a movie about nuclear war wiping out the human race, and the Pentagon did not want American military hardware attached to that idea. Officials worried the film could fuel ban the bomb sentiment and damage support for U.S. nuclear policy. They also argued that the movie exaggerated the danger. In simpler terms, their position was, yes, nuclear war would be catastrophic, but the world did not yet have enough nuclear weapons to kill every human being on Earth. So to them, On the Beach was not just politically dangerous, it was scientifically too pessimistic. Kramer moved on without the Pentagon. Instead, he used HMS Andrew, a diesel-electric Royal Navy submarine stationed in Australia, to stand in for the Sawfish. And while the Pentagon resisted, the Royal Australian Navy cooperated, providing support through Exmouth Melbourne, Williamstown Naval Dockyard, and naval personnel who appeared as extras. Number 7. The film erased an entire war. In Kramer's film, the cause of the nuclear war is kept deliberately vague. Nobody can say exactly how it started, who fired first, or which country deserves the blame. Fred Astaire, who plays the guilt-ridden scientist Julian Osborne, gives the film's clearest explanation when he says, "The war began because people believed peace could be maintained with weapons they could never use." The film does not turn the apocalypse into a history lesson, it turns it into a moral warning. But Neville Shute's novel is completely different. In the book, there is no mystery at all. Shute lays out the war step by step. Albania drops a nuclear bomb on Naples, then someone bombs Tel Aviv, nobody knows who. The United States and Britain respond with a show of force, flying military aircraft over Cairo. The next day, Egypt sends every bomber it has to attack Washington and London. But those bombers were Soviet-made, and they looked like Russian aircraft, so NATO retaliates against the Soviet Union. Over 4,000 cobalt bombs are detonated. The book gives readers a clear chain of decisions made by specific nations, with each act of violence triggering the next. Kramer threw most of that out. By refusing to name one guilty nation, the film makes every nation guilty. Number 8. The title hides a secret meaning. The title On the Beach has a darker meaning than it first appears. On the beach was Royal Navy slang for a sailor who was no longer at sea, either retired or out of service. Nevil Shute, the author of the novel, would have understood that meaning. He was not just a writer, he was also an aeronautical engineer who served in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve during World War II. So the title quietly suggests that every character in the story is already out of service. They are not preparing for the future, they are waiting for the end. The title also echoes The Hollow Men, a 1925 poem by T.S. Eliot. The poem is famous for its bleak vision of empty, powerless people facing the end of the world. The connection comes from these lines. In this last of meeting places, we grope together and avoid speech. Gathered on this beach of the tumid river. It contains the image of people gathered on a beach, and it ends with one of the most famous lines in modern poetry. This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. That is exactly the mood of On the Beach. The world does not end with one final battle. It ends quietly, while people wait for the radiation to arrive. Number 9. The White House feared this movie. The Eisenhower administration did not just refuse to lend a submarine. Declassified documents reveal that the U.S. government treated On the Beach as a genuine national security concern. On December 4, 1959, less than 2 weeks before the film's premiere, the United States Information Agency issued an official document called an info guide, directing American embassies on how to handle questions about the film. The Atomic Energy Commission prepared a separate set of scientific talking points designed to counter the movie's claims, emphasizing that the movie was, in their words, science fiction and not science fact, and that it contained serious scientific errors. The government was not worried about the film's accuracy. They were worried about its persuasiveness, the possibility that millions of people around the world were asking uncomfortable questions about the weapons their own governments were building. What do you think? Was the government right to be worried, or did they just prove the film's point by trying to suppress it? Number 10. This film led directly to Dr. Strangelove. The connection between On the Beach and director Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, released 5 years later in 1964, goes deeper than most people realize. Both films depict the end of humanity through nuclear weapons. But where Kramer's film is earnest and devastating, Kubrick's is savage and absurdist. Multiple critics have pointed out that Dr. Strangelove can be read as a satirical response to On the Beach's sincerity. Where Kramer asks the audience to weep, Kubrick forces them to laugh at the same horror. The Soviet doomsday device in Dr. Strangelove uses cobalt thorium-G, a direct descendant of the cobalt bomb concept that Nevil Shute built his novel around. And the connection does not stop there. In On the Beach, Astaire's character warns that the world may have ended because of a fault in a few vacuum tubes or transistor circuits. Another nuclear war film in 1964, Failsafe, that fear becomes the actual plot. A computer malfunction sends American bombers toward Moscow, and the system becomes almost impossible to stop. So the connection is not the story itself, but the same nightmare. Humanity destroyed by machines, procedures, and one small technical failure. On the Beach did not just tell a story about the end of the world. It opened the door for an entire genre. Number 11. The year Shute accidentally got right. When Shute published his novel in 1957, he set the story in 1961 and 1962. He chose those dates for no particular prophetic reason. It was simply the near future. But 5 years later, in October 1962, the United States discovered that the Soviet Union was secretly building nuclear missile sites in Cuba, only about 90 miles from Florida. President John F. Kennedy responded by placing a naval blockade around Cuba to stop more Soviet weapons from arriving. Then the crisis became even more dangerous when an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, and a Soviet submarine near Cuba nearly launched a nuclear torpedo. For 13 days, the world came frighteningly close to nuclear war. The circumstances were entirely different from Shute's scenario, where the war begins with Albania bombing Italy. but the year matched almost exactly. Do you think that was pure coincidence? Or was 1962 always the year the Cold War was most likely to boil over? Number 12. The Streets That Remember the Stars. When On the Beach was filmed partly in Berwick, then a small town on the outer edge of Melbourne, the production left behind something stranger than a movie set. Nearby residential streets were still being developed, and some of them were named after people connected to the film. Shute Avenue honored Neville Shute, the novelist who imagined the story. Kramer Drive honored Stanley Kramer, the director who brought it to the screen. Gardner Street honored Ava Gardner, the film's leading lady. Even Fred Astaire, the most surprising name in the cast, reportedly had a street named after him. Astaire Drive was later changed, but the other names remain as quiet reminders that this suburb once stood in for the last place on Earth. Number 13. Shute worked on real weapons before writing about them. There is a reason On the Beach feels so technically believable. Neville Shute Norway, his full name, was not just a novelist, he was a trained aeronautical engineer. In the 1920s, he worked on the R-100, one of Britain's major early airship projects. Then, during World War II, he served in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, helping develop experimental weapons and devices for the war effort. Some of that work was connected to D-Day, the massive Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, when British, American, Canadian began pushing Nazi Germany out of Western Europe. So when Shute wrote about machines that had grown beyond human control, he was not imagining that fear from a distance. He had lived inside the world of engineers and weapons development. That is why Julian Osborne, the guilt-ridden scientist in On the Beach, carries such weight. In the film, Astaire says, "The devices outgrew us. We couldn't control them. I know. I helped build them. God help me." Shute saw himself in Julian not as a bomb maker, but as someone who understood the danger of weapons growing beyond human control. Number 14. The author's rage may have hastened his death. Shute was not just disappointed with the film, he was furious. He publicly called it a bastardization of his work. His complaints were not vague. He hated that so many roles had gone to Hollywood actors, and he especially hated how the film softened radiation sickness. In Shupe's book, radiation death is ugly, physical, and slow. There is nausea, vomiting, ulcers, blisters, burns, and the body gradually falling apart. The film kept the idea of radiation sickness, but removed much of that horrifying detail. To Shute, that was not just a small change. It weakened the entire warning of the story. Shute was not completely outside the production at first. Early on, he had some involvement with Stanley Kramer. But as the changes piled up and his objections were ignored, he pulled back almost entirely. According to his daughter Shirley Norway, the family believed his anger over the film may have hastened his death. Shute died from a stroke on January 12, 1960, less than 4 weeks after the film's world premiere on December 17, 1959. He was 60 years old. Shirley also recalled that Shute had said he would never let another one of his novels be turned into a movie. On the Beach is not a film about nuclear war. It is a film about what people do when they know the end is coming, and the answer is heartbreaking. They love, they race cars, and they try to go home. The weapons that inspired this story still exist today, and the question it asked in 1959 still has no answer. Do you think we've moved any closer to making sure the story stays fiction? Tell me in the comments. If you're new here, hit subscribe because we do this every week with the films that shaped a generation.